There are saints whose names are sung in cathedrals, carved into stained glass, remembered in feast days and golden icons. And then there are others. Those whose stories you'll never find in prayer books, whose miracles were witnessed, documented, and then quietly buried. Not because they failed to live holy lives, but because their holiness refused to play by the rules. Canonization is a careful process. A miracle must be proven, a life must be examined, and the path to sainthood must align with doctrine. But what happens when the miracle breaks the doctrine instead? What happens when a body refuses to decay, but also refuses to die? When prayers bring the dead back, but hollow? When divine visions contradict Scripture entirely? The Church has always feared chaos disguised as divinity. Not because it's false, but because it might be true in a way they can't control. Hidden deep in Vatican vaults are ledgers never shown to the public, catalogs of anomalous devotions, unauthorized apparitions, unclassified intercessions. And in the margins of these books, there are names, not heretics, not demons, saints, or rather, those who would have been saints had their miracles not defied the boundaries of comfort and control. They're known in whispers as the erased blessed, souls who lived on the edge of the sacred, where holiness bleeds into horror. Their relics are hidden, their stories scrubbed from hagiographies, but traces remain, in letters, in local legends, in churches without names, in towns where a strange statue still weeps on Thursdays for no known reason, in children who speak languages they've never heard, only when passing certain graves. These aren't myths, they're patterns. And those patterns raise a question the Church could never answer publicly. What if sainthood isn't bestowed, but rejected out of fear? Tonight, we open the vault that was never meant to be unsealed. We listen for the prayers that were never meant to be repeated. And we begin with the first of the forsaken, the saint who bled not from wounds, but from willingness. Welcome to Tales from the Forbidden Library. If this kind of forgotten truth draws you in, consider lending your voice to the comments. Like this chapter if it resonates with something buried deep in your memory, something you were told never to ask about. And now, we begin. His name was Father Albinus of Vercelli, though even that is uncertain. Most records refer to him simply as Il Rosso, the Red One, not for his hair or garments, but for the impossible phenomena that followed him. Wherever he walked, blood was not a symbol. It was a source, and it flowed not from wounds inflicted, but from voluntary surrender. Albinus was a monk in northern Italy during the late 14th century. He lived in silence, spoke only when addressed, and tended to the dying in a remote mountain hospice built atop an abandoned Roman temple. The place was known for its remoteness and for a single impossible rumor that people who arrived there on the edge of death left within days, laughing, walking, healed. They said he could bleed on command, not from self-harm, not from stigmata, but from intention. His hands would open, not split, not gash, but unfold, as if responding to something unseen. And the blood that poured forth was warm, thick, and smelled faintly of myrrh. It was collected in cloth, dabbed on wounds, pressed against the foreheads of the unconscious. And it worked. Not always, not without cost, but often enough to inspire terror in the church that sent envoys to observe. Witnesses described the blood as singing in the bowl, not audibly, but with a pressure, a hum that filled the room like silent music. The monks said they could feel it in their teeth. Some claimed it vibrated through the walls, making stone feel alive. The church's observers weren't impressed. They were unnerved. They noted that Albinus never called on Christ when he bled. He never prayed aloud. He simply closed his eyes and listened, as if receiving instruction. When asked who he spoke to, his reply was unsettling. Not who, what waits beneath the mercy. The phrase was repeated in his Inquisition trial years later. when the hospice was mysteriously burned to the ground and the survivors scattered. Albinus was arrested, but he never resisted. And when they tried to extract confession by force, the torturer collapsed of internal bleeding within moments of touching him. The records call it coincidence. The monastery's version says otherwise. They say the blood knew the difference between harm and healing. Before his execution, Albinus reportedly told the priest sent to absolve him, "There are wounds you beg for, not to die, but to give. My blood was never mine. I only opened the door." Then he died smiling, hands clasped, not in prayer, but in offering. His name was stricken from the records, his body buried without ceremony. But decades later, strange healings began again in the same region, performed by travelers who claimed their dreams led them to a red stone basin half buried in the earth. When water was poured into it, it turned dark, viscous, and warm. Albinus never claimed sainthood. He never asked to be remembered, but he bled as if remembering someone else, someone forgotten, someone the church could not canonize, because doing so would mean acknowledging a divinity that did not obey. And the church, above all, fears miracles that answer to no one. She entered the convent without speaking, not out of disobedience or defiance, but because she claimed she had already said everything worth saying in a life she no longer remembered. Her name was recorded as Sister Verena. No surname. No place of birth. Just a girl with sunken eyes and scars across her lips, as if silence had been sewn into her long before vows were taken. She never wrote, never hummed, never responded to questions with nods or gestures. But when she prayed, strange things happened. It began with the writing. Scrolls, at first few, then dozens, began appearing beneath her pillow each morning, covered in tiny, slanted text, sometimes Latin, sometimes Greek, occasionally a script unknown even to the convent's archivists. No one ever saw her write them. She was watched, studied, tested, yet the scrolls kept appearing soaked in candle wax and ink that shimmered like oil on water. The texts were unlike anything the sisters had seen. They weren't sermons, nor scripture. They were instructions, descriptions of healing rituals, sacred geometries, musical keys that opened trance states, recipes for oils that invoked visions. And in the center of each scroll was a symbol, hand-drawn but recurring, a closed mouth encircled by radiating lines, like the sun behind locked lips. Some of the rituals were tried. A dying sister was anointed with an oil described in one of the scrolls and awoke the next morning, not healed, but reciting a psalm in perfect Aramaic, a language she had never studied. Another nun, who had been blind since birth, stood silently outside the chapel one night, then calmly announced she could see the stars. She never spoke again. The church dispatched investigators. They brought parchment from the Vatican's secretum, hoping to match the unknown language. One scholar fainted upon reading a fragment and claimed he had heard the scroll speak inside his mind, whispering the name of someone he had never told anyone he'd lost. He was found dead 2 days later, his mouth filled with beeswax. They confronted Sister Verena, demanding explanation. She simply placed her hand over her lips and lowered her head. When they tried to seize her, she wept, not from fear, but from mercy. The records note that the moment her skin was touched by the cardinal's assistant, his tongue swelled to twice its size and never returned to normal. He spoke in riddles for the rest of his life. They burned the scrolls, or tried to. Some refused to ignite. Some produced not flame, but a low chime when struck with fire, like a bell struck underwater. Verena disappeared a week later, gone from her cell. No broken locks, no signs of struggle, just a single final scroll placed beneath her pillow. It contained no words, only the symbol, a mouth closed tightly, encircled by stars instead of sun. Years later, a mirror in the convent's chapel reportedly cracked in silence, and every nun present heard a whisper behind their eyes. "I still speak, just not aloud." The church called it mass hysteria, but to this day, the convent's confession booth has not been used. Not because no one sins, but because whatever waits behind that screen already knows. They called him Pastor Soren, though he was not ordained, nor did he ever lead a church. He was a quiet man who tended sheep in the hills of southern France in the early 1600s, living alone with a rusted cross tied to his belt and a scar across his chest that looked like it had been carved there in deliberate shapes. He did not pray loudly. He did not preach. But the villagers spoke of him in hushed reverence because he had a habit of walking into houses where someone had just died and walking out with them, standing. There were no rituals, no candles, no words. Soren would simply place a hand on the chest of the deceased, wait in silence, and then nod, once slowly. And the dead would breathe. But they never came back whole. They remembered nothing. Not their names, their families, their past. They followed Soren like sheep, silent and serene, eating little, never sleeping, never weeping. They responded to kindness with gentle nods, but seemed disturbed by mirrors and avoided their former homes. When asked who they were, they replied in unison, "I am who was chosen." The church dispatched missionaries to investigate. One of them recorded this in a letter. "I beheld a child who had been buried 3 days prior, now walking barefoot in the fields. I asked her name. She said, 'I remember light,' and then he called me." Her eyes were wide and kind but hollow, like windows left open for too long. The villagers were grateful, but unsettled. Some begged Soren to return their loved ones to the grave. Others pleaded for him to restore memory. He refused both. He claimed it was not his decision. "I only knock," he said. "I don't choose who answers or what remains behind." Then one day, the shepherds noticed their own sheep behaving strangely, avoiding certain paths, bleating in distress at invisible shapes. Soren was seen speaking to something in the woods, hands raised as if in apology. That night, 3 of the risen vanished. Their bodies were found days later, crumbled, brittle as leaves, with their faces eroded smooth. The town held a vote. Some wanted him canonized, others wanted him exiled. The bishop arrived with a small entourage to demand an explanation. Soren led them to a nearby grove, overgrown and strangely warm even in winter. Beneath one of the trees was a circle of stones, 8 in total, smooth and red, humming faintly. "These are the ones who chose to stay," he said. "The rest are waiting for new names." He was never seen again after that. The grove still exists. No plants grow within the circle. No birds land nearby. And if you enter after sunset, some claim to see children with empty eyes, standing in the dark, whispering prayers in no known language. The church deemed the entire account apocryphal. No canonization, no blessing, only a footnote in a regional report marked "Suspicious Revivals, Doctrinally Incompatible." But in forgotten corners of Europe, candles are still lit for the shepherd who called the sleeping, and always beneath the flame there is no name, only the phrase, "He gives breath, but not memory." The first time they tried to kill him, the fire wouldn't catch. It was a cold autumn morning in 1491 in a village on the outskirts of Krakow. A man named Tomasz the Hollow was accused of heresy, not for preaching, but for surviving. Survivors had watched him walk through fire to rescue a woman from a burning mill. But when he stepped back out, his skin was untouched. His eyes were black from smoke, but not from fear. He said nothing. He only handed the woman to her family and walked away. People started whispering. Then came the stories. He was thrown into a river after refusing a priest's blessing and floated upright, eyes open, for 3 days without food or breath. He was buried after a bandit attack, but the grave was found empty the next morning, the earth sealed tight. Someone claimed to have seen him standing barefoot on frozen ground with no tracks leading in or out. The church arrived soon after. They charged him with blasphemy, witchcraft, and unnatural defiance of death. But every attempt to execute him failed. Fire smoldered and died. Water refused to drown. Knives rusted when pressed against his flesh. One official tried to crush him beneath a stone, only to find the stone shattered and Tomasz standing beside it, weeping, not in triumph, in sorrow. He was finally sealed inside a monastery crypt. No trial, no rites, no records, just a slab of limestone marked with no name and the words, "Lest he return." But he did return. 60 years later, during renovations, monks broke into the sealed crypt. They found it empty, save for a set of footprints leading to the wall and through it. That same year, a village to the south reported sightings of a barefoot man who refused food, who healed sick animals by touch, and who disappeared whenever someone tried to follow. They called him the walking wound, the man who never bled, but whose presence made wounds close on others, the man who touched you and left a warmth in your bones you couldn't explain, the man who cried when you asked him why he was alone. Scholars would later describe his case in Vatican archives as a persistent occurrence, meaning a person or miracle that appears repeatedly across centuries, unchanged. The Church has a list of them, most labeled as mythic anomalies. But Tomasz was different, because no matter how many times he reappeared, he never claimed holiness. He never preached. He only begged, in broken tongues, for others not to look for him. He said nothing about heaven, nothing about hell, only this: "They made a mistake. I was not meant to get back up, to get." And to this day, there are scattered reports, in rural Poland, in quiet Swiss villages, even once in the highlands of Peru, of a barefoot man walking calmly into burning buildings, only to leave alone. He never stays long. He never says much. But the moment he's gone, the flames begin again. There is a room beneath the Apostolic Palace that most do not know exists. It is not on maps, not in tours. It is accessed only by those carrying a key made from 3 different metals: bronze, silver, and something no one speaks aloud. Inside that room is not a library, not in the usual sense. It is a vault, and in it lies a single book, bound in oxblood leather, sealed behind glass, and guarded not by scripture, but by silence. Its title is Sanctorum Non Grata, the Book of Unwelcome Saints. It is not supposed to exist. This book contains the names of those who once walked the path of sainthood and were turned away, not for failing, but for succeeding in ways the Church could not explain, control, or bless without consequence. It begins with a list of miracles, each one marked not with praise, but with warnings. A child born glowing, whose presence caused others to remember forgotten ancestors. A woman who aged backward and whose tears reversed death, but only once. A man whose voice cured madness, but made listeners forget their own names. A blind monk who wrote prophecies in languages that predated known civilization. All were investigated. Some were imprisoned. Some vanished. Their stories were cut from public record. But the miracles remained. The Vatican scribes who compiled the book did not do so in reverence. They called these figures distortions of divine order. One note reads, "Their miracles are not heresies, but are evidence of a deeper grammar of God we were not meant to read aloud." In the margins are sketches, symbols, untranslated prayers. Some resemble musical notation, but not for any known scale. Others are just circles with names inside, crossed out, rewritten, then crossed out again. And at the back, an appendix marked only with the Greek letter O. Here lies a warning. A paragraph written in 9 languages, each faded differently, as if time decays them at separate speeds. It reads, "These are not tales, they are echoes. These saints were not rejected. They were hidden, for your safety, not their shame. Their miracles were not errors. They were early arrivals." Rumor claims the current pope has never opened the book. Others say he reads it yearly in a sealed chamber and weeps. Some of the names inside are said to still appear on relics found in abandoned churches, in places where statues cry blood, in towns that no longer exist on any map. You might have passed a painting once, a statue, a name etched into stone too faint to read, and wondered, why have I never heard of them? Now you know. The church didn't forget them. They were erased for performing the one miracle that institutions cannot tolerate, revealing that the divine does not need permission. There's a reason you've never heard of these saints, not because they lacked power, but because they had too much of it, and it didn't ask for permission. These weren't gentle stories fit for church windows. These were fractures in the fabric of what the church could safely sanctify. They didn't die beautifully, or preach neatly, or fit the roles written for them. Their miracles weren't metaphors, they were interruptions, reminders that the divine has never been fully tamed. What if sainthood isn't something bestowed by men in robes? What if it's something that rises on its own, bleeding through the cracks in doctrine? There's a pattern beneath history, one you only see when you look too long at the margins. The quiet nun who writes in her sleep. The man who never dies, but weeps at fire. The shepherd who gives back breath, but takes the name. These aren't just stories, they're coordinates, whispers scattered through centuries. Not erased, just hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that's the most dangerous miracle of all. Not healing the sick, not raising the dead, but surviving the attempts to be forgotten. Becoming the saint that does not need validation to be real. Because if miracles like these are possible, outside ritual, outside scripture, what else is possible that we were never meant to know? That's the danger. And that's why their names were never canonized. Not because they failed the test of faith, but because they passed a test the church never wanted them to take. So next time you walk through an old town and feel something ancient stir, or see a statue with no plaque, no name, no eyes, or whisper a prayer and hear an answer that comes from nowhere, but knows your name, remember this. Not all saints wear halos. Some wear silence, some wear ash. Some still walk beside you, erased from the books, but not from the world. Welcome to Tales from the Forbidden Library. If this story stirred something hidden inside you, leave your trace in the shadows. I'd love to know which of these forgotten saints haunted you the most. Now, let's give this story the music it deserves.